morning, everybody. My name is Ashley Sokol, and I have the pleasure of introducing our first panel's moderator. I'd first like to acknowledge Jillian Bauer, who thoughtfully helped coordinate this conversation, not just for the sustainability panel, but today's event overall. Jillian unfortunately cannot join us today, but we have a wonderful pleasure of Dr. Kate Clark stepping in on behalf of Jillian. Dr. Kate Clark is the director of Western's Environmental and Sustainability Program and an associate professor in the the Master of Environmental Management program. Her favorite courses include social movements, environmental justice, and policy. She is engaged in community-based grassroots campaigns to build more sustainable and democratic electricity systems. In the last year, she completed 2 courses with Solar Energy International in Paonia, Colorado. These courses taught her how to design and install a grid-tied solar PV system, and she is excited to bring Solar Energy International's curriculum to Western students next year. Dr. Clark and the sustainability panel will directly engage with the audience for the Q&A portion of their session. Please help me welcome Dr. Kate Clark and our sustainability panelists.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. In just a moment, I'll ask our panelists to introduce themselves, but just for the sake of names and titles, today we have Sarah Sandberg, Head of Sustainability and External Affairs with PDC Energy. John Messner, the Commissioner of the Colorado Energy, of the Colorado Energy and Carbon Management Commission, and a former Gunnison County Commissioner. Our newly reelected, as of last night, Mayor of the City of Gunnison, Diego Plata. He's also the Corporate Sustainability Analyst for Stantec. For our first question, folks, please restate your names and give us a little sense of your backgrounds. Let's start with Sarah.
Wow. My name is Sarah Sandberg, and I've had a really interesting arc in energy. My first job straight out of school was I worked in communication in the Louisiana governor's office, and Deepwater Horizon happened. And I was essentially the advanced person for the recovery operation from the governor's perspective. So I had a very intense first encounter with energy. Having grown up in Baton Rouge, it was always around me. But I moved to Colorado fresh off of that experience saying, you know, I'm going to show the energy industry what they can do better, what they can improve on, take the experience that I had. And I was looking for jobs outside of oil and gas, as you can probably imagine, and literally couldn't get a hot job at Whole Foods. It's not a joke. I applied everywhere and anywhere. And ultimately, a friend of mine connected me with the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, COGA, and I told them everything that I thought that the industry was doing wrong. And they said, great, you're exactly what you need. You're hired. The next 5 years, I built our community outreach strategy along the Front Range of Colorado, and was, as you can imagine, the person that was the friendly face of fracking. Tough job. Got my car keyed, got a death threat on Twitter, still there. Send her back to the swamp in a body bag is what it was. Got followed with a note on my car, had an extremely intense experience trying to do what Kayla was talking about. Have collaborative conversations, listen, engage, work to develop energy along the Front Range of Colorado. So happy to talk about that another time, but was ready to go and get out. I ended up working for a company called DCP Midstream, which was a Fortune 500 company based in Colorado. Came in as public affairs, eventually did investor relations, ran some of our JVs, and ultimately built and executed our sustainability strategy as a company, and led our new energy function within the company. Phillips 66 acquired our company at the beginning of this year. I went to a company called PDC Energy to build out their sustainability program. I was there 7 weeks when Chevron announced acquisition of that company. Interestingly, in their, I believe, 7-page deck announcing the acquisition of PDC, this is a multi-billion-dollar acquisition, the last slide was about decarbonization and how the production of PDC Energy, a company based in Colorado, was cleaner than Chevron's molecules overall. And so I think that does speak to what Kayla was talking about, that Colorado is producing some of the cleanest molecules in the world. So I've been very happy and delighted to be part of the sustainability story of Colorado, and looking forward to the conversation with y'all today.
Hello. Good morning. My name is John Messner. I'm one of the commissioners with the Energy and Carbon Management Commission at Colorado. Used to be called the Colorado Oil and Gas or Conservation Commission. Prior to that, I was a Gunnison County Commissioner for a while. I actually moved to Gunnison in 1991 to attend Western. And it's been a long and winding road over the years, spending almost 30 years in Gunnison before I had the opportunity to begin working with the state of Colorado for the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. Lots of different changes over the years. I initially started working in the oil and gas sphere from a regulatory perspective when I was a planning commissioner with Gunnison County. Gunnison County was one of the first local governments to develop local oil and gas regulations in the state. At the time, we were both sued and challenged by the state of Colorado as well as different industry groups as we did that. But we eventually developed our own oil and gas regulations, and then in turn, that authority offered to local governments to regulate oil and gas in the state was memorialized by Senate Bill 19-181 in 2019, at which point I was given the opportunity to serve on the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission as a volunteer commissioner while I was still a county commissioner with Gunnison County. And then in turn, the commission became a professional commission, full-time paid commission, and was appointed by Governor Polis to be the local government and land use seat on the commission in 2020. And so I have since moved to the Front Range to take on that role, where we've instituted a number of different rulemakings over the years to implement both Senate Bill 19-181 and a lot of other legislation around oil and gas and other energy development in the state of Colorado. In addition, I have now been elected chair of the newly created Colorado Produced Water Consortium. And so that's a new project that's happening now. And so a little bit about myself.
Thank you, John and Sarah. Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for having me. My name is Diego Plata, and I am the mayor for the city of Gunnison. I call that my side job, but I do also have a job. My job, as Dr. Kate Clark mentioned, is a corporate sustainability analyst for Stantec. Stantec is a multinational architecture, engineer, and environmental services design firm. We focus a lot on energy, renewable energy, and we do a lot of work in oil and gas as well. To my mayor role, I got the great experience of partaking in implementing what we've coined our Gunny Cares 2030 plan. Gunny Cares 2030 plan was actually brought to the city by a fellow Western alum from the MEM program. And it holds the city's feet to some pretty lofty goals to go net zero and reduce our carbon footprint by 2030. I'm really proud of that plan and all the work that has gone into it. We are hopeful now that we last night passed a ballot initiative to improve a lot of our infrastructure as it pertains to streets, can move some of those goals along and can start planning for some of their resource allocation here locally. Professionally, as I mentioned, I'm a corporate sustainability analyst, and it sounds like, though we just met Sarah, we may have similar roles at a corporate level. At my job, I am tasked with measuring, analyzing, and reporting out on our environmental, social, and governance metrics. Many of you are familiar with ESG, and whether you're for it or against it, it's in many ways here to stay, in particular because of many forthcoming regulations. As a Canadian headquartered company, we are under requirements by the CSRD in Canada. We will soon be under requirements by the SEC here in the US to report on our ESG metrics. And for me, I find it as a really important role from the perspective that it holds our corporation's feet to the fire to ensure that we are performing well under these various ESG metrics and are moving the needle, not simply checking the boxes. So that's a little bit about me and what I do on both of my jobs. Back to you.
Thank you so much, everyone. And audience, we intend to have a few minutes at the end for questions, but you're perfectly welcome to submit those questions during the conversation as well via Slido. Hopefully you're seeing those QR codes somewhere close by. And particularly if you have a follow-up, I'll look for an opportunity to interrupt our conversation with those questions where appropriate. Moving on, everyone, how do you define sustainability? Where does sustainability rank as a priority within your organizational goals? And what does the success case for sustainability look like for you in the energy revolution? Let's go to Diego first for this one.
Great, thanks. I'll just keep going on where I was. I see sustainability as a more holistic approach of how to run an operation and the output that comes from this. I think many people will immediately come to what comes to mind is when they hear the word sustainability is, do we recycle? Do we turn the lights off? But there's a lot more to it than that. And I believe, particularly perhaps from a biased perspective, that ESG does a good job at capturing all of the things that make up sustainability. And those are environmental factors, social factors, and governance factors, because it isn't just about recycling and turning off the lights, but it's also about the people. Under social metrics for Stantec particularly, we measure how are we fairly compensating our employees? What kind of benefits do we offer our employees? And are they fair and equitable for all that are involved? Under the governance metrics, we have to make sure that our board and our C-suite is walking the talk and not simply stating that we're a sustainable company. And so if those policies aren't coming from the top down, I don't really think that there's a path forward for any of the other metrics to move along. At an operational level within the city and for the residents of the city of Gunnison, I see it in many ways under the same lens. While we've got Gunny Cares 2030, which certainly takes into account a lot of the environmental factors that we need to consider as we move into a future with under a climate crisis. Internally for the operation, we're going through the initial phases of some DEI training. We've gone through numerous phases of ensuring that our benefits and our compensation is fair to our employees so they can continue to deliver the services for the city and its residents. And under a governance stance as a city council member, that's in many ways the biggest hat that we have to wear, making sure that the policies we put in place are in fact sustainable, not just for environmental and social reasons, but from a policy perspective.
That's one follow-up question. I think one of my jobs here might be to help everyone spell out acronyms and define our terms. You use the term DEI, if you wouldn't mind explaining what you mean there.
Yeah, thank you. DEI being diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thanks for the question. Certainly an important question, but I think from my perspective in the role that I'm in now in the state of Colorado, which is a commissioner with a regulatory agency, sustainability to me is akin to protection. And so I say that because in 2019, with the introduction of Senate Bill 19181, the role of the regulatory agency around oil and gas at the time, and now expanded to include more energy technologies, shifted in its mission from fostering oil and gas development with consideration for protection of public health and the environment to regulating oil and gas in a way that is protective of public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. And in that, the overall arching goal is how do we allow energy development to occur in the state of Colorado in a way that is protective of these things. And so that essentially required the state to reimagine its oil and gas regulations holistically throughout the state and really re-envision how energy development occurs, permitting in particular, occurs in the state of Colorado. You know, it's issues around siting, it's issues around community engagement, it's issues around water quality and water quantity, emissions, financial assurances, wellbore integrity, you know, lots of different elements that are included in how we regulate oil and gas development and other emerging technologies in the state now in a way that is protective of the citizens and the environment in the state of Colorado.
So when I think about sustainability, I think about generating a financial return while intentionally and constantly improving outcomes for stakeholders. And I think years ago, when we thought stakeholders as a corporation, we just thought about shareholders. That was primary. And that has really changed over the past decade to be more inclusive of employees, as Diego mentioned, of communities, of a variety of different stakeholders. And so we are operating across a variety of planes, trying to perform against certain ESG metrics, but also in a broader sense, sustainability has now become the third stool of the leg that a business has to consider when you think about risk, your strategy, and sustainability. Those are now the three guiding principles within an organization as we think about how to execute our business model moving forward. And that really was not the case in the past. When you think about a lot of the things that we're doing, they don't necessarily generate returns. And we now do them because not only is it an expectation of our stakeholders, but we are constantly trying to improve our performance because we have a higher level of transparency than companies ever have. The ESG reports, sustainability reports, CSRs, whatever you want to call them, we have a lot of acronyms, a lot of words for essentially the same things that go out. I would encourage you to go read them from energy companies. Doesn't matter what sector of the energy industry you're interested in. They are fascinating. And I would encourage you not just to read the one that was based on last year's data. Look at one from 3 to 5 years ago and compare how quickly progress is being made in the industry. It is amazing. It's something that all of our, from a professional perspective, we do from a peer review basis. We're constantly learning from each other because there is so much transparency in the industry right now. And what Kayla was talking earlier with the 2 pieces of legislation that came out, a lot of times sustainability used to be a cost center. You look at companies like Phillips 66 now that have 2030 targets of $1 billion in EBITDA from low carbon revenue sources. And so these are companies that are now making money by pivoting their entire business strategies towards a decarbonized economy. So this has been a really amazing evolution that's happened. And I do want to point back to what Commissioner Messner was saying. There is a lot of collaboration that's happening to make sure that protection is at the forefront. PDC, the company that I was most recently employed with pre-acquisition, went through a multi-year process that worked with the state, that worked with a variety of local governments. All of the things that John just ticked off as priorities in terms of water usage, community engagement, financial assurances, PDC has done a 10-year CAP, which is comprehensive area plan for hundreds of well sites, working with communities. What do we need to do? How can we do it best? So that there's full transparency and very consistent expectations of what development in the state of Colorado looks like. And I think it's a real success in terms of forward-thinking, low carbon energy production that the state of Colorado has held up as a model for the rest of the country. So I give a lot of credit to PDC, a lot of credit to the state and local governments for working together on that project.
Thank you, everyone. And we've got quite a few questions coming in. Audience, know that you'll help me decide which of these to select by giving thumbs up to the ones you're most interested in hearing an answer for. So please do that. I'm going to follow up with 2 of these now. And I think I might direct this first one to Sarah and Diego and the next one to John. First, are oil and gas economically sustainable? Will sources more cost-effective than renewables soon run out? Are companies getting ahead of this? John, certainly you're welcome to speak to this as well, but I thought these might be best for Sarah and Diego.
So I think there were a lot of questions in that one quick thing there. What I would say is companies are very quickly trying to get ahead of it. I'll focus on DCP's approach because I was there for 5 years. We had an approach where we prioritized 3 different time horizons as a company. One was clean the core. At the time when we launched this in 2020, we spent 80% of our time cleaning our core operations, which meant taking as much carbon emissions as we could out of our base operations in the field. We spent, 70% of our time on that. We spent 20% of our time on a component that we called adjacent to the core. That was things that we had core competencies within our existing talent pool to execute. These were things like carbon capture and sequestration. At the end of the day, that's transporting CO2, which is a gas, which is what we transport every day, drilling a well and permanently storing it in the ground as a means of decarbonization, in partnering with our upstream customers like a PDC Energy. That's a core competency we already have. We were additionally looking at hydrogen, some other long-term things, and we called that beyond the core. Those were things that we didn't have in-house core competencies in, but we needed to stay well aware of. So we were going to be fast followers on beyond the core. We wanted to be cutting edge on adjacent to the core. And honestly, clean the core was just the ante to the table for operating in Colorado and other states in the US. As a company, we had been operating with a pretty small executive committee. We built an entirely new executive function solely focused on emerging energy and transformation as a company. And so when we think about, our oil and gas company is going to be sustainable, we no longer thought of ourselves as an oil and gas company. You think about Statoil turning into Equinor. Companies are just going to be energy companies. When you see the companies that have the capital to invest in the emerging technologies that you're going to see deployed from a decarbonization perspective, in many cases, it's going to be traditional oil and gas companies that do that as they pivot to long-term sustainable business models. I hope that answered the 17 questions that were in that one question. Diego?
I'd like to hear the 17 questions again.
Okay. Okay, there it is. Apologies. Are oil and gas economically sustainable? Will sources more cost effective than renewables soon run out? Are companies getting ahead of this?
So Stantec is not an oil and gas company. We're a consulting company. And that's important to differentiate because while certainly we service and provide ideas or sell ideas to oil and gas companies or other energy companies, our sole focus is not in the oil and gas field. We do, however, operate in that area, being from the Western oil fields of Canada. That's where we're headquartered and it primarily started for us. And so, yes, we have a lot of stake there. That said, the backlog within Stantec's operation continues to decrease as it pertains to work coming from oil and gas for us. And that's, I see it as twofold. One, internally, strategically, much like Sarah's operation, we have begun to transition from being this company to pivoting into this type of company. And it's not to say that we are dismissing what we can and cannot do for oil and gas, but rather there are just different services that we can provide to oil and gas fields. And so financially, I don't necessarily think that there will be a huge piece of the pie for Stantec to be had in the mid to long-term future. But we will continue to support oil and gas field as they make those transitions because we see the writing on the wall as well for our clients. And that is, those companies are making the transition themselves. How can we support them along the way? That's where we come in. And from a renewable energies, that piece of the pie appears to be growing for us as well. And so I do think that the pivot is coming not simply as a result of the focus on sustainability, the focus on how do we mitigate the climate crisis, but also the numbers themselves are speaking. And as one piece of the pie shrinks and the other one grows, as a player in the free market, we pivot to where we can make some revenue.
Thanks, Diego. And again, I mean this question for John, but Sarah and Diego, please step in as well. This is our most highly rated question so far. Do you think government subsidies create conditions which protect oil and gas companies more than the environment?
So I think there's two different levels to that question, or a few different levels to it. So there's different subsidies or different approaches that are taken by the federal government versus state governments versus local governments. And so I think that in some respects, there historically has been a lot of subsidies that I think have fostered oil and gas development. A lot of oil and gas regulatory agencies, conservation commissions in different states around the country really were developed to foster oil and gas developments, and a lot of tax incentives and tax policies associated with energy were really designed to foster oil and gas developments. That started in the early 20s, and really ramped up through the 70s and 80s as we started to have energy crises, around oil and gas. I also think that you see those same same types of subsidies being utilized for emerging technologies right now. You're seeing wind, battery storage, and solar being subsidized to try to foster and to try to encourage that renewable energy development. And I think at the same time, you're starting to see certain states reimagine how oil and gas is being regulated in those states to shift from that fostering of oil and gas development to more of a regulatory type of approach that really looks at protective measures around oil and gas. It's not regulatory processes are not necessarily designed to discourage different types of energy, but rather to ensure that should that energy development occur, that it occurs in the right places, that it has the right considerations, that it is taking the right technologies and best management practices associated with those activities, and it's developed in a way that's protected. And that's true of oil and gas development. That's true of emerging technologies like carbon capture and sequestration, like deep geothermal, like underground natural gas storage, hydrogen. And I think you're continuing now to see additional pressure occurring, particularly at the local government level, around potential impacts associated with wind development, power, electricity transmission, and solar. And so these things, all tie together. But to get back to the root of the question, I think certainly historically, those subsidies did what they were intended to do, which was subsidize and foster energy development. And I think certainly it did encourage that. And I think now you're seeing a transition from that to those same approaches being taken for renewable energies.
Thank you, John. Do either of the other panelists want to respond to that question, or we can move on? Okay. All right. I'm going to sort of combine one of our planned questions with one that I'm seeing some interest in here. We intended to ask you about stakeholders and how you identify your stakeholders and engage in them. Yet some of these questions are also talking about the unfortunate consequences of silos. So could you talk to us a little bit about how you understand your various stakeholder groups and how you might be able to engage with them in a way that breaks the potential for siloing?
Well, from the city's perspective, I think it's one of the key ways in which we were able to engage more stakeholders, at least on my term on council, has been quite a simple approach, but a really effective one, and that was to translate things. For those of you that don't know, I was born and raised in Venezuela, and Spanish is my first language, and so I brought with me to council a little bit of that cultural diversity and an understanding that not everybody can quickly comprehend anything and everything that's available in simple English. And so I've, on the heels of the work for many within the community, led from the top to ensure that everything that the city put out was done so in both Spanish and English, or any resources that were made available were translated. That's one example. The other example, I think, comes through situations, though this isn't much of a conversation. It's community events like these, where we invite anyone and everyone, both from within the city limits, as well as those that are just outside of the city limits, to come and join us for a conversation around what is the police department doing? What does the clerk's office? What are they tasked with? And how do they perform their core service? And really just trying to get the word out through the various means of communication that we've got available to us now, particularly Facebook, social media, email blasts, et cetera. But going back to that DEI point from earlier, really understanding that if we don't think about everyone that could potentially be at the table, and we don't identify how we are not opening the space up for those individuals to come and be part of it, then they may not necessarily show up. And so for the city, it's been a really important fact or process to just take a comprehensive look at who's showing up to the meetings, who's missing and why, and then figure out why and try to engage. I'll leave it there. I feel like Sarah's going to have a similar response on a corporate level.
I think Colorado has a lot of lessons learned in community engagement in oil and gas. I think that if you think back to 2011 through 2014, sort of the height of the fracking wars, it was extraordinarily contentious between the industry and communities in Colorado. And there were a lot of lessons learned from the industry side. And again, I know I keep harping back on Kayla. She had a lot of good core components to her talk, and one of them was really about building trust. Do I think that we're there? No. Do I think we've come a long way? Yes. I think initially when I came in the industry, this is just one woman's opinion, and now that I'm not employed by anybody, I can just say what I want these days. But I do think that there was a little bit of, hey, we can't say that till we have to say it. We can't share that until we have to say it because someone's going to use it against us. And I think that a lot of different parties around tables felt that or mistrust with all the other stakeholders when it came to energy development. We don't want to talk to them because they'll use it against us. And I think over years, we've just realized how ineffective that is, and that we're going to have to extend trust if we're going to move forward with a proactive, community-centric approach to energy production that is protective of all of the things that John has been talking about. Have we executed perfectly? No. But when I transitioned from the Oil and Gas Association to DCP to PDC, it's no critique of any of those, but I've only seen it improve in terms of, oh, we just learned this. Let's reach out to the community immediately. Let's talk about this immediately. We got to call the commission immediately. And that has resulted in relationships that are very strong with landowners, with regulators, where they can say, they can call us. It's two-way street and say, hey, we saw this, what's going on? It's a different environment now. Is there still contention? Absolutely. Is it what it was where like I mentioned, where we were getting death threats on Twitter? No. I think that we're moving into an environment where trust has been built because everybody took a little bit of their pride, put it in the back seat, took a little bit of risk and said, we've got to do it together. And so I think silos in Colorado have been broken down really well. I think you see a lot of constructive e-NGOs out there that say, look, the reality is we all want to get to net zero. This is how we're operating today. We have to work with oil and gas companies to have the cleanest outcomes for today. And that's a shift in stance for many of those organizations. And so, you know, when we come back to Jessica's last question of what do you feel optimistic about? I feel optimistic that this trend will continue. And the collaboration is only going to increase. The commission does a really good job of letting you know who you need to notify within what distance of your operations. And that is a very robust process from an oil and gas company perspective. This is door knocking. This is regular community meetings. An outcome of the pandemic is that for an example, all of the residents within a certain area of our cap, which is tens of thousands of residents, we have quarterly community meetings for them just to give updates. We have one next month that's to introduce Chevron as the new operator. And those are all digital now from the pandemic. And so you can include so many more people that aren't encumbered by inability to travel to an open house or things like that. And so we're getting a lot more engagement because we have moved to a digital platform, which is nice.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that. And this is all really good information that's being talked about here. But you know, stakeholders are incredibly important in regulatory processes in the state of Colorado. I mean, the stakeholders, you know, and I'm certainly not going to hit all of them, but whether that's, you know, working with industry, local governments, you know, environmental and community NGOs, and just a really broad array of folks to look at stuff in a couple of different ways. And so as a state regulatory agency, we've got rulemaking proceedings where we're developing the policy, we're developing the rules that help implement legislative intent, statutory intent to us in order to be able to promulgate the rules to, you know, continue to develop protective regulatory schemes around energy development. Through those processes, that community engagement, that local government engagement, that, you know, NGO engagement, that industry engagement really helps craft those rules in a really collaborative and cooperative way as we, look to implement, different new directives. In addition, the entire development of the new mission of the now called ECMC really was designed to increase transparency, to increase community engagement, and to make hearings accessible to folks that are interested in participating in our process. And so whether that process is relevant local governments, which means the local governments in which these permits are being contemplated, whether they're proximate local governments, which means these are governments that are adjacent to the relevant local government, but have standing to be able to participate in our processes. It gives affected persons opportunities to be able to engage in our process. It really has expanded that process to not be in a silo where the state was and industry were essentially making decisions on their own, but rather opens up that process to allow significantly more engagement from a broader perspective of the community in decisions that we're making that affect these folks. And I think that ends up being a really important piece of how that stakeholder piece works. I think in addition, you're seeing a really strong emphasis at the state right now around environmental justice and utilizing ombudspeople to be able to bring those voices to the table that typically don't have the ability or lack the knowledge to be able to engage in these really complicated processes at the state. And so that will continue to be an emphasis in, how do we engage disproportionately impacted communities? How do we utilize our environmental justice toolkits to be able to ensure that those missing pieces have a voice in our process as well?
Go ahead, Sarah.
I can just hit on a different component of this as well, because I was creeping on the Slido. There's a lot more destruction of silos between the sectors of energy than there used to be as well, not just from a external stakeholder perspective. For example, at DCP, we got called all the time. We're a large landowner because there's a lot of land around your gas plants. Solar companies were probably calling me once or twice a week. Hey, how can we work together on a joint venture of a project where we use your land, we install the solar, we can power your gas plant, send some back to the grid. There's a lot going on cross sector that wasn't happening before because everybody has realized how interdependent our infrastructure can and should be, and our skill sets can and should be.
Thank you. So many questions coming in, hard to decide. I think I'm going to come back to some of these in just a moment. A lot of this conversation in the last few minutes has been focused on, I think, some of the principles or practices behind successful engagement. Shifting to the issue of success, could each of you give us an example, a specific example if possible, of an instance of success in your work in the organizations or firms that you work with?
I'm happy to start. And so I have to say that I'm incredibly proud of the work that the state of Colorado and the commission has done around the implementation of Senate Bill 19181 and other legislation that has come to us to reimagine a regulatory structure at the state and basically turn it on its head is a little bit of an unheard of process. And the fact that we were able to work with stakeholders and work with folks around the state to really relook at how oil and gas is regulated in the state and look at it through the lens of protection of public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources has been a really proud moment for me. And I think that the success of that is starting to resonate in, across the country and in different parts of the world as well. And so the state of Colorado is really being held up as an example of ways that you can have a regulatory scheme that is protective of, I call it FSWE, so that's public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources, but still have a successful energy sector within the state. And I think that ends up being a really important piece. And so the idea of regulating energy is not to stop energy. It's to ensure that should it happen, it should, it should be in a way that's protective, and it should be in places that it makes sense for it to be. And the impacts associated with it should first be avoided, then minimized and mitigated to the extent feasible and possible. And I think that really, that theme is really important. But ultimately, I'm proud about that success, and I'm looking forward to our new mission that was handed to us this last legislative session, or additional mission, additional authorities that we're being asked to regulate around carbon capture and sequestration, around deep geothermal development, around underground natural gas storage, and appears in the near future to also potentially include hydrogen, coal mine methane, and some other emerging technologies that are happening.
One that readily comes to mind is probably one that's easy to overlook, and it's setting the 2030 and 2050 decarbonization goals as a company. I think it would be easy to assume that that's, oh, you just set them and then you start going towards them. Well, as a publicly traded company, you're making a firm commitment to your investors and to other stakeholders that, for example, with DCP, by 2030, we will have reduced, in our case, absolute emissions by 30%, which means regardless of any acquisition activity, we will get absolute emissions down, not intensity numbers. And you can't just throw a dart against the board and say 30%, 40%, 50%. You're now pulling in engineers, operations, a variety of different skill sets and functions across your company to think in an entirely different way than they were used to, on top of their day jobs, for a goal that's never been part of their metrics as a company ever. And so this required a massive cultural shift, a massive technical shift within the company to be able to track emissions in real time, understand exactly where they're coming from, and how we put the goal out in 2020, how 10 years from now we're actually going to be able to do this, because you cannot tell your investors you're going to do something without a plan. And so we had year by year exactly what we're going to do, including some very hard decisions, including divesting or completely shutting down assets that generated money but were too emissions intense for our company and the company that we wanted to be. And so the cultural shift that took is probably something that I'm most proud of in my career, being able to help pull that over the line. It was a new way of thinking that companies have had to adopt, and we've seen that mindset evolve, continue, progress, improve in a way that has attacked other problems and initiatives within the organization with a zest that wouldn't have existed previously. So that's been a real win for companies.
I'll speak to a real success for the city, and I mentioned it earlier, and that is the Gunny Cares 2030 plan. We are a small community in the rural Rocky Mountain region with a pretty tight budget, like many rural municipalities. And for us to have forged ahead with some incredibly lofty goals during the pandemic and actually pull together this 2030 plan, to me means the world in many ways. I find it important from engaging our stakeholders, because a lot of the goals and priorities that were put into this plan came as a result of stakeholder engagement with the community, with the voters. The plan itself came together as a result of 2 MEM students. And so we were able to tie in one of our more valuable assets here in the county, which is Western. And for the city itself, it again creates a plan for us to actually try to move forward so that we can attain some of these lofty goals. These include climate action focused goals, renewable energy focused goals, waste reduction goals. And there are some aspects of it that are socially focused, but this one does primarily focus on environment. Given the tremendous weight that the pandemic had on everybody around the world, and still having the fortitude and will to push ahead to come up with this Gunny 2030 plan, which was adopted in 2021, I found that to be one of the most rewarding pieces of my work on council thus far. And similar to not being able to go to your stakeholders without a plan in place, we can't quite go to the voters or the residents without a plan. And so while some of these are going to be incredibly challenging to meet, we at least have some metrics in place that we can strive to meet. And with, as Dr. Kay Clark mentioned, a newly elected council as of 11 hours ago, we will have to come to the table and reprioritize some of those goals as best as possible so that we can use our resources and energy available to meet some of the criteria that we've set forth for ourselves.
Thank you, everyone. Audience, I just wanted to note that I'm seeing quite a few questions about issues of environmental or climate justice, issues of distribution and disproportionate burdens carried by marginalized communities. We might be able to get to some of these questions, but I also wanted to highlight that they would be a focus of the next panel in ensuring just transitions. Thank you for those questions, and I did want to acknowledge those. For our conversation now, I'm going to build on two of the most popular so far. So first, I'll phrase this question as a statement. While renewables are cleaner, they make energy access for low-income families more difficult. So hear that as an assertion and a challenge, with the assumption being that one of the keys to success would be decreasing the costs of cleaner renewable energy sources. A different question, this is the question I'm posing for all of you, is can profit be a guiding principle for sustainability, or can financial incentives be a guiding mechanism to get us to a sustainable energy system? So because that was quite a lot, I'll say once again, can profit be a guiding principle for sustainability?
Yes. Just kidding.
You'll have to tell us more.
I spoke quickly because I have something comes to mind immediately. So thank you for letting me take this one first. I'll put on my job hat for a second here under Stantec and go to some of the key performance indicators that our board members as well as our C-suite members are held to when it pertains to this exact criteria. These key performance indicators take into account a myriad of different types of metrics. Among them are profitability and the performance when it comes to the bottom line of the company. How do we make that move forward and keep sustainability top of mind for them? Well, we tie their pay to it. And so our board, as well as our C-suite, has direct links when it comes to the company's operational sustainability performance and what our C-suite and our board members are paid on an annual basis. Now, for many, those are exuberant numbers nonetheless, regardless if they make the bottom end of their pay scale. But that drives the incentive into the leadership's mind to ensure that they're working as hard as they can to meet some of these goals. And for Stantec, for example, we have what we call, and it's regularly coined as, but we've signed on to a sustainability linked loan. Our revolving credit facility is tied to our performance on a specific ESG framework called the Bloomberg Gender Equality Index, which measures how are we doing as an operation when it comes to gender equality within our operation. Depending on how we score on this particular index, our sustainability linked loan interest rates are adjusted, which impacts the bottom line. And so that's one example of how I would why I quickly jumped to yes on that question.
I'm also a yes on this one. We have the same metrics tied within our STI and LTI. We also had the first ESG linked financing for the midstream industry at DCP. The two metrics that we had within our financing structure, and it moved up and it was meaningful. The money that we could save or get charged additionally was absolute emission reduction year over year and safety mechanism or safety metrics. And so we are trying to not just have words and say, oh, these are our goals 10 years out. We're trying to show we are impacted by our performance financially today. One thing I'll say is that capital produces energy. That's how we get energy is capital. That's it. As a publicly traded company. And to attract capital, capital is chasing returns. That's it. So we cannot execute on projects as a publicly traded company that don't produce returns. That's it. So if you look at other structures of how companies are financed, whether it's private or publicly funded from a government perspective, they have more wiggle room. But I think the reality is anyone you see NYSE listed, NASDAQ listed, those projects are going to have to produce returns. When you look at the IRA, for us, we were looking at carbon capture projects, tons of projects that had been shelved because they were not economic. immediately became an economic and were put in front of our executive committee, like dusted off and presented on a silver platter. And they were like, oh, this is actually what we want to do now. That's why the new function was created, because there were the financial incentives to move forward on lower carbon, decarbonized projects, which was great.
And let me jump in there. Sarah just mentioned the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. Students, I want you to know there'll be a class focused on the Inflation Reduction Act this coming spring. That's ENVS 380. So consider that. I think we're going to you next, John.
Thanks. And I think the responses are right. I from a regulatory agency, I think it's important to acknowledge that I think industry understands that there is a social license to operate. And I think, as our keynote speaker indicated, it's becoming less of a right and more of a privilege to be able to do energy development in the state of Colorado. Now, having said that, I'm continually impressed by the steps that the energy industry is taking to embrace that social license to operate and develop technologies, best management practices to go beyond what the regulatory process is requiring of them right now. And so it's not every operator that's out there, but I think you're starting to see different operators starting to lead in this sphere. And I think they lead in this sphere partly because of the social license to operate, but partly because I think they're starting to see a value add to that type of behavior in how they're approaching energy development, at least in the state of Colorado. And I think that value add ends up being really important. I think that you're hearing the communities speak, whether that's directly through processes that I'm involved with, or whether that's through their elected officials, that there's a certain expectation of these companies to be able to operate in the state of Colorado. And I think that affects profitability as to whether or not they're willing to step up and meet that bar. And in a lot of instances, I think you're seeing a lot of companies exceed that bar and really begin to lead in the state of Colorado in a way that is a model or an example of the way that companies could do this in other states and in other countries around the world. And so have been continually impressed with that.
So real quick, Diego and I really focused on sort of shareholders to a certain extent. This is external community members, social license to operate. Another component in terms of doing this really well is recruitment and retention of top talent. And in Colorado, that's very hard. We have seen, especially over the past 2 to 3 years in Colorado, extreme consolidation on the oil and gas side. I'm the perfect example of that, with Phillips buying DCP, Chevron buying PDC. Both of those headquarters were here in Denver. The acquiring companies, they're based in Houston. In many cases, the corporate staff is either let go or moved to Houston. Small amount are retained and moved to Houston. So from a corporate perspective, the industry is really losing talent in Colorado. I'll be very direct about that. I think it's hard to find good people. It's hard to keep people in Colorado in this industry. And employees are very much looking at which companies do this well and which companies do not. Yes, there are companies that can make money right now because generally commodity prices are conducive to that. We have actually very low break-even costs here in Colorado, especially on the Front Range. Employees are not going to, especially if you're Colorado-based, you're not going to go work for a company that's a high emitter. You're not going to go work for a company that has bad HR policies. It's all now completely transparent. And so if you're going to operate in Colorado long-term, you have to attract the top talent because the pool is so small. And this is the best way to do that.
Thank you, Sarah. Did I see you wanting to jump in, Diego?
Yeah, I just figured I'd round it out with one point on from the municipal perspective. And while the government, the local government is not necessarily out to make a profit, we do have to be good stewards of the revenues that we receive through tax funding. And that's why the city of Gunnison did sign and is in process of completing an energy energy performance contracts through the state. And this is a great program that the state of Colorado offers to look at our operations. And while we had to take out a somewhat significant loan to upgrade many of our facilities, the return on that investment will come through when it comes to a lot of the energy that we're saving, which will reduce the cost of the energy that we need to pay for. And so from a municipal perspective, that there is a play there as well.
Thank you very much. All right. So much of this conversation and the remarks from this morning centered on trust. Some of these last comments focused on transparency, social license to operate, and related issues. So I think this question follows from that. Why should communities trust the companies responsible for leading climate denial campaigns?
Well, I can't say I've ever worked for a company that has led a climate denial campaign. If you look at the companies that I've worked for, we have very clear, direct statements on human-caused climate change and what we're trying to do to address that. And I think hopefully that builds trust in the specific companies that I've been a part of and that I think are leading the way in Colorado. Are there bad actors in this industry? Yes, just like any other industry. I think what's been very interesting about the oil and gas industry is how the companies that are trying to go above and beyond regulations, that are trying to lead a more productive, solution-oriented, forward-looking conversation, not necessarily are brushing aside companies that aren't up to tack, but you see small coalitions being formed that are getting things done in the state of Colorado and in the country at large. And we know that to have a sustainable oil and gas company for what we believe is decades to come, we cannot answer to the lowest common denominator. We must move forward. We must support regulations. We must be proactive in communities in terms of engagement. That's going to build trust with communities. And if companies don't act that way, I think that the market is going to quickly deal with companies like that.
So I'm not going to talk about trust for particular companies or for an industry, but I'd like to talk a little bit about trust in regards to the state of Colorado and in particular the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, because I think that as I had indicated before with the previous mission, and understand the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, like I said before, is now Energy and Carbon Management Commission. But because I'm talking about back in the day, I'm utilizing the COGCC terminology. But our goal at that time was to foster oil and gas development, and really was less interested in interacting with the community and more interested in ensuring that more energy development occur in the state of Colorado. And that included permitting operations, near homes, near schools, not following up on certain enforcement procedures, not collecting enough financial assurance to ensure that operators had the ability to pay for the retirement of their operations. And we lost a lot of trust in the state of Colorado amongst constituents in different communities because of some of the decisions that the state of Colorado made in permitting these different things. And I think it's been important now that we have reimagined the commission to rebuild that trust. And we're not there yet. There is still a lot of communities, still a lot of individuals around the state that still don't have that level of trust with the commission or the state of Colorado, that we are permitting in a way that is protective. And we continue to hear feedback from communities. We continue to evolve our regulatory processes. We continue to review our policies to build upon that continued feedback loop that we're getting from communities and local governments and NGOs to continue to try to build that trust. And a lot of that ends up being an engagement piece and engaging with cumulatively impacted communities, disproportionately impacted communities, really looking more broadly at these impacts that these citizens around the state are seeing, And how do we evolve our regulatory process to better engage, to better understand those impacts, and then be able to address those impacts in a permitting process to help rebuild that trust within our organization.
Thanks, Aaron John. And with 19 seconds, Diego, would you like to take this one?
I'll take a quick stab at it from the municipal perspective, and that is, it's okay to be a little bit mistrustful. That's all right, but don't hold anybody necessarily in contempt. My encouragement would be to show up to the meeting and partake, because otherwise you're just standing on this island with an opinion, which is valuable, but without actual engagement and an understanding of what the details are, it's really easy to just hold somebody in contempt. So my encouragement would just be, come to the meetings, read the minutes, check out the agenda.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our audience members for your excellent questions. Again, I hope we can revisit many of those in the next session. Please, everyone, let's thank our panelists. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Laramie for an announcement on that next session.
We have a quick transition between this panel and the next. We'll ask our next panelist to come on up on stage, and we'll give them just a second to get settled, and we'll start right in on our Just Transitions panel.
Yeah, she put that wrong on here. Okay, our tally. Our tally. Yes, that should just be, it should be all set for you. All right, hello everyone. My name is Abby Gridley, and I have the privilege of introducing our next panel moderator, Emily Artali. Emily completed her BS and MS degrees in environmental engineering from the University of Colorado at Boulder. She started her career working within the field of remediation, water treatment, and all things sustainability and climate related. In 2012, she started a boutique sustainability consulting firm called Lotus Engineering and Sustainability LLC. Lotus's niche was climate action and resiliency planning with an emphasis on greenhouse gas emission accounting and climate equity. In the summer of 2022, she decided to shift her focus to teaching. Today, Emily is a mechanical engineering lecturer in University of Colorado at Boulder Partnership Program with Western. She helps prepare students with the skills necessary to be sustainability leaders in their communities by teaching them practical climate action planning and solutions centralizing equity and inclusion. Outside of work, you can find Emily playing in the outdoors and celebrating all of the good things in life with family and friends at 9,000 feet in the Rocky Mountains. Emily and the Just Transition panel will use a Slido to engage with the audience for the Q&A portion of their session. Please join me in welcoming Emily Artali and our Just Transition panelists.
Me okay? Okay. Sorry, no, I talk quietly. Thank you all for being here and joining us. I'm really excited about this panel because I know this is a really critical issue that sometimes we don't talk about enough and can bring up a lot of challenges, especially if we don't give it the recognition that it deserves. So before we start, I want to just emphasize that we are committed to climate action and adopting cleaner and safer forms of energy. However, we know that this transition is going to impact all of us differently. For many of us, the transition is going to bring a lot of positive benefits. Moving away from fossil fuels is going to bring cleaner air, cleaner water, a less warming planet, healthier ecosystems, and healthier people. But we know that others, especially those whose livelihoods depend on the revenue generated by the fossil fuel industry, might have a future that's a little bit less certain, particularly our working class. So the point of the discussion today is to talk about the nuances and the complexities of this transition. And we ask our panelists to talk about their perspectives, their experiences, to talk about the problems of the past and the present, and to look forward to the future with a solutions-oriented lens. Now, just transition, the term can mean different things to different organizations. So for today, for our discussion, it simply means transitioning away from fossil fuels while creating as little harm as possible for those whose livelihoods depend on the revenue generated by the fossil fuel industry. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. I'm going to ask all of you to give an introduction to your background, your perspectives, anything that will help the audience understand why you're here. Luke, why don't you start?
Thanks, Emily. Hi, I'm Luke Gilderton. I'm Deputy Director of Energy Outreach Colorado. And before I was into energy, I was into water. And about 24 years ago, I had an amazing experience that changed my life forever, working on an environmental justice issue of water contamination that was flooding 100% Black community, and from a corporate chemical company, and was part of the remediation, the cleanup efforts in the homes, educating the community around the toxicity that was poisoning their families, and was successful in kind of changing the outcomes for that community. And that led me into later on in my career to focus on energy, use my engineering skills for good and societal change and positivity. And since then, my work in Energy Outreach Colorado has been really focused on affordability, accessibility for all, lower income energy consumers here in the state.
Great, thank you, Luke.
Hi, everyone. My name is Annie Beal. I live here in Gunnison, Colorado, and I currently work for the Colorado Energy Office, and I'm in their building decarbonization team. And I'll share a bit about my background, what brought me to working for the Colorado Energy Office and being here on this panel. I have an undergraduate degree from the University of Colorado in environmental sociology when that was just starting to emerge. I graduated in 2011 as a young millennial. And then I got into affordable housing, and I was a college counselor for young people living in affordable housing. And my goals there were to support students to reach a higher education and families to achieve economic self-sufficiency, access health, access transportation, all the important components that come into your home life when you're living in a secure, affordable house, how you can then gain stability in the other important aspects of your life. And so that really motivated my interest and value in housing and the role of housing. And I thought I would kind of get away from housing, but I moved here to Gunnison to pursue my master's degree, and I just kept getting back focused in on housing and really focusing on climate action and how our built environment and our homes are such an important place for us to conserve energy, save money and have a healthy environment. And that has really driven my interest in climate ready buildings and homes as a mechanism for climate action and health equity. And I'll pass it on to Derek.
Thanks, Annie.
Good morning. Welcome, everybody. I'm Derek Watchman, and I want to first, as I've been hearing lately, I want to acknowledge the ancestral lands here of the Ute tribes. I think that's always important to recognize, at least for me, our ancestors. But I'm actually a member of the Navajo Nation. I've been spending many years in energy, but initially after college, I got my MBA, and my focus was on Wall Street investment banking. But when I got into the market, being Navajo, my focus was how to get capital to Indian country. And so there's many challenges if you look at the history of American law and tribal government. There's a history, but it's fascinating to me, and it's really hard to get capital to Indian country. So, but I'm also from a political family. I had a grandfather who was on the Navajo Nation Council. My late father was a New Mexico state representative. And so there I got to know the former Secretary Bill Richardson, former governor. He passed a couple of weeks ago, but he was a good friend of mine. When he got named to be energy secretary, out of the blue, he called me and he said, "Hey, Derek, I really want to, I'm going to energy. I really want to connect the Department of Energy with tribes. And I know your history." So I actually had the opportunity to work for him as his tribal affairs director. And so my job with him was to connect, if you look at the United States Department of Energy's footprint, they're in many, almost all the states in this country, and many of them are right adjacent to tribal reservations around the country. And so, we're pushing, obviously dealing with nuclear spent energy transportation. We're dealing with energy efficiency. How do we connect the power marketing agencies with tribes, workforce transition, tech transfer, you name it. Those are some of the things that I worked on. And so after that, I actually was invited to be in our Navajo Tribal Utility Authority, which I still am. But during those other moments, I was a banker, and also I was CEO for our Navajo Nation Gaming Enterprise. And so, I come today to you as a consultant. And so I advise the Department of Energy on several projects. I'm really trying to figure out how to work and how do we capitalize and how do we bring meaningful capital to Indian country so that reservations can grow and flourish. And so I'll talk about later, but there's still a lot of, desperate conditions on reservations. And so in many cases, when I talk tribes, they say, well, you're okay with the casinos. And no, that's not exactly true. In those areas where you have big populations, sure, gaming works for tribes, but many reservations still have a lot of conditions where employment's high, income levels are low, infrastructure is terrible. And so, but it's good to be here, and I'm looking forward to today's topic. Thank you.
Thank you all. So the way that this is going to work, I have a series of questions that we've worked together and I've shared with all of you. So we'll go through a couple of those, and then the audience, if you'd like to use Slido, you can submit questions and we'll address those. So we'll just go back and forth a little bit. So for the first question for the panel, we'd love to hear more about who your stakeholders are and what experiences you can share that are important to demonstrating the importance of just transitions from the perspective of your stakeholders. So basically, what does a successful just transition look like to your stakeholders, and who are those?
I'll start.
Okay.
For me, the stakeholders, in my opinion, are the 574 federally recognized tribes in this country. And there's two in this state here. And then I know the Northern Ute claim some portions of land in the western north part of Colorado. And so, but when you look at the economic conditions of reservations, it's very, very low. And COVID really rose to the attention, the limited and lack of infrastructure. Even though, there's tribes around the country and you hear a lot of the success rates, a lot of the communities, back at the casino or back at these big operations, we talked about oil and gas operations, there's still a lot of homes with 2 or 3 generations living, in one household, no running water, limited electricity. And so for me, growing up on the reservation and being able to work on and off reservation, I see these conditions. And so, the question and my goal is, how do we improve, basic living conditions on many reservations? How do we get housing? How do we get running water? How do we get electricity? And so, but many tribes have been basically landlords for many natural resource activities, coal mining, oil and gas, and all those other things. And so up to this point, many tribes have been landlords. And so with the just transition and moving into this new era, I see a lot of tribes wanting to move forward and be a part of the development and move away from and move into renewable energy projects, but still try to benefit until, I guess, the last moment, oil and gas royalties. I know that a lot of tribes, like my tribe, for example, my tribe Navajo, half of our revenues comes from the coal production by Farmington. And so, unfortunately, the coal mining there and the power plant is scheduled to shut down in 3 or 4 years. So the question now is, when that shuts down, what does my tribe do? And so I think, it's incumbent upon all of us, we're talking about collaboration, or how do we work together so that all of our community sectors benefit from moving into, carbon minimization, carbon reduction, and solar power. So, thank you.
Annie, would you like to go?
Sure. Okay, so in the Colorado Energy Office in the building decarbonization team, I'll lay a little landscape where Colorado has 2.5 million existing buildings, and homeowners and business owners pay $7 billion annually in energy costs. And that really amounts to buildings being our 5th biggest sector of energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a big sector to tackle, and folks in our department are doing this via codes, via benchmarking, and we're also doing it via the implementation of federal funds to improve energy efficiency and support electrification. And the project that I'm working on with my colleagues is regarding the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and that is federal funds that are coming to all of the states. And we are developing a program to deploy these funds across the state equitably. And within this framework of funding, there are Justice 40 requirements where at least 40% of the funds must be going to communities that haven't historically been served by federal funds and have historically been excluded from energy efficiency measures. And so we're using a tool, and sure, we could show it now. This is just a map, so I thought I would have you all look at the state of Colorado. And this is a tool provided by the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, CDPHE. And this just gives a really great data assessment of different communities throughout the state, how they're allocated by census tract. And we're using this information in our stakeholder engagement to figure out what stakeholders do we want to reach. So we do want to reach state and local governments. We want to reach community groups that have been organizing and established in energy efficiency and electrification throughout the state. We want to access groups that have been in the community oil and gas communities and in the shadow of oil and gas communities. And so we're using these mapping tools to see where those are. I guess an interesting component that informs my work is thinking, okay, why is there a community experiencing some of these extra layers, and how can we informingly go and get their feedback and input into developing our programs? So for a just transition, it's a process of understanding the economics of a community, the reasons why they might be involved in oil and gas or might be experiencing environmental burdens and health inequities, and then working to develop our programs to not just address energy efficiency, but to also address the other components involved in a more just ecosystem and a more just economic ecosystem and health ecosystem. Yeah, thank you.
And then Luke, we'd love to hear from you.
So at Energy Outreach Colorado, we're a private nonprofit with a mission to ensure all Coloradans can afford their home energy. And we are serving a majority of our program participants. Household annual income is below $30,000, and very, very low income levels that we're providing are kind of critical services of providing energy assistance for when households fall behind on their bills, being able to provide energy efficiency services for those who really have very little options on how to finance those improvements to their home or their buildings or their apartment buildings. And also ensuring that there's a little more access when it comes to renewable energy programs, specifically through community solar gardens, and thinking about how to really strengthen that voice at the advocacy level with all of our work at the Public Utilities Commission and at the legislature. And I think, when we think stakeholders, we think, low income energy consumers is really who we are representing. And what we hear time and time again from the households we're serving is that, is the biggest concern around, their sensitivity of increasing energy cost, how that might also impact, their transportation cost of getting to work, how that's going to impact their food pricing, and also some of their medical expenses. And I think that that's just important to call out that when, we're focused really on energy, the households that we're serving are really thinking about how to manage all these costs. And so much of the rising price of energy can have a huge impact on all those commodity costs for households. And I think, as we, try to really work with these households to kind of figure out, and number one, really listen to some of the historical issues they faced, specifically around accessibility to these types of programs, and some of the concerns that they have. It's not always necessarily around price, and kind of trying to reach what they deem as a really an affordable energy bill. It can be around bringing in new opportunities for their community, that attract new workforce and also potentially, keep some of their younger generation in rural communities. That's something that we hear constantly when working in rural communities. We hear as well around just the idea that, there's always this concern around the urban-rural divide and the concern that many of the benefits are only going to be shared by those living on the Front Range and not, some of the rural communities who really contributed historically to the Colorado economy. And so, I think from our perspective, we're trying to always kind of relate energy affordability with just some of the dynamics of the changing culture within the state and how to make sure with, authentic transparency, how can we really kind of talk to these communities about these opportunities, and also be honest about kind of the risk of kind of sharing some of the burdens that are going to come with it, and make sure that these benefits are equitably distributed.
Great, thank you all. Our next question is, what is your ideal vision of the role of grassroots organizing, labor unions, and workforce development in the just transition? It's a good one, I can see.
It is a good question. I know that, we have, for example, large transmission lines proposed to cross reservations. And so, like, for example, the Dakota Access Pipeline, that activity generated a lot of feedback from a lot of Native American NGOs. And so I see a lot of them really pushing to to increase the awareness of renewable topics, getting back to our roots. And so the NGOs are unfortunately, I think, heavily financed. I see NGOs in our areas actually being staffed by the National Resource Defense Council, the Sierra Club, Grand Canyon Trust, and I think that's good. But on the other side, the issues that they're trying to address are actually, preventing development. And so when I look at Indian country, we're still in a state of nation building. We still have limited amenities. Many of us, we still have limited opportunities. And so, we're in the game, but we're still at an early stage. I've seen a lot of reports out there that Indian country is 30 or 40 years behind. And the question is why? Is it because we're on a reservation? Is it because of American policy, U.S. government policy, or what is it? But the fact that the NGOs are raising the awareness, I think that's great. On the other side, though, it's preventing development. And so and many tribes, especially here in the West, have been benefiting a lot from, basically royalties from oil and gas development. And so our tribes still need to have those benefits until we move into, what we're talking about, clean energy. And so when it comes to unions, labor unions, I don't see that too much in Indian country. So I don't see that as a problem. Although I did, when I was running our casinos on the reservation, I did have, for example, the culinary union, try to organize, I'll say, my workers. And so, but my tribe and many other tribes really don't have organized labor laws. And so basically I use the Navajo government law to say that organized laborers are not allowed right now. You have to go talk to our leadership. But I thought that was interesting. Folks from Las Vegas were coming out to Wonder Rock trying to organize our labor union. And so, but I think in many cases, most of the wages are fair, if you will. The problem that we have when it comes to labor workforce development improvement is that because we're so remote, it's hard to provide housing. It's hard to provide decent education, healthcare. And so in many cases, we have a lot of our young Navajos, actually Navajos in general, even. I was a part of a study in 2020. If you look at Indian country, there's roughly almost 7 million registered Native Americans. Over 60% of them actually live off reservations. And that statistic is actually getting worse. And so a lot of the elders and seniors, who we have a lot of respect for this, they say, Shuyaja, young guy, how do we bring home our families? Because without that, we're no longer nations, we're no longer people, we're no longer a part of the society. So, thank you.
Okay. Annie, would you like to take this next?
Sure. Yeah, and thinking about workforce development, that's a huge part of deploying federal funds throughout the state, because we want to be bringing new technologies of heat pumps and electrification and insulating homes and assessing the home's status and its values of being able to perform well and not use as much energy and respond to cold and heat temperatures. So we need a lot of workforce to be making these home improvements and building improvements. And we do have demographic challenges across the state where a lot of these energy efficiency and entities exist on the Front Range and in smaller groups in rural areas, and they are really small companies. And a lot of times workers in those companies also need a living wage and need support to have that be a viable career. And it's also a transition from employees who are, or workers and experts in their field who have been plumbers and electricians to start to learn new technologies, whether you're not installing a gas line anymore, but now how can you become an expert in designing a heat pump and installing those systems. And so there's a lot of upskilling initiatives and a lot of that is going on, and that's going to be a critical role in deploying these funds and getting them out to homes and buildings. And also in this scope, we're looking at individual single family homes, manufactured homes, which are also called mobile homes, and also multifamily homes. And there's a whole different sector of needs to support multifamily homes where you have 4 units, 10 units, 50 or 100 units. How are you supporting the upgrades for those buildings using different types of workforce? Maybe a local contractor here can really support doing that for a single family home, but are there the big teams to then be able to really upgrade a multifamily building? And I think that's sometimes where the labor unions come into effect, where labor unions can bring a bigger force of labor and also provide us with the information of this is what these types of workers need. This is the rates. This is the way that they stay safe and can inform our program design. So we're embedding those parameters into our program development and putting funds into those needed areas. And I know, Luke, you can talk so much more on this topic as well. And I think one thing I would think of when you did ask about kind of grassroots organizing as a last comment, I think there's a lot of impact in grassroots organizing when we are deploying federal funds and building programs. If there are grassroots organizing happening in rural communities or urban communities, they're ready to say, this is what we want for our community. This is how we envision these funds being utilized. And that is automatically a group that we can go to and listen to and get their input into program design and then ultimately into program implementation. So I really value the grassroots organizing and being ready to respond to federal money and state program implementation.
Thanks, Annie. I really appreciate you calling out the need to listen to communities first when it comes to workforce needs and potentially valuing their input around what kind of economic opportunities they want for their community. I think I was a part of the Recovery Act, and in 2000, or I was a part of administering those programs for the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act, the ARA, in 2009. And I certainly, at the time, obviously it was extremely challenging to get a job as a rooftop solar installer, or even as an energy auditor at the time because of, really the job availability and the economy. And it was a difficult experience because there was all this funding coming from the Department of Labor of really trying to prioritize communities that have been left out of clean energy jobs, and trying to have an emphasis on those maybe who were formerly incarcerated and trying to create career pathways for those who had lost their job in the housing or the finance world because of the recession. And I think it was extremely difficult to kind of experience, a population of attendees for classes and trainings who had very little opportunity in actually capitalizing on this training. There were very few jobs out there, and what jobs were out there, they were not going to be competitive in that market because they were competing against college educated, individuals who were seeking those jobs as well. And so I think just as a lesson for us in this next phase to be honest about that. And number one, that starts with kind of listening and making sure that that's the kind of economic opportunity communities want. And thinking around, exactly, how we're going to be honest around some of the shifts that maybe have to happen, given the salaries that are associated with our traditional energy sources that might change when shifting into clean energy sources. I think that's been an issue as well, is this idea that we're going to be able to bring manufacturing jobs and jobs that can replace the same salary as some some of the miners, the coal miners in Craig experience, or some of those who folks who operate generation assets, or those who are currently linemen for the electric utilities. Making sure that that there really is a respect that we need to, it can't be a decrease and a loss for these communities in terms of economic opportunity. And I think that getting back to grassroots organizations are kind of be the ones who hold the state and our federal government accountable in that quest to kind of rewrite some of historical wrongs when it comes to workforce, and kind of be really more intentional around trying to expose and guarantee some of the larger salaries that can come with some of these clean energy opportunities. And that really does exist in the construction space, which is really exciting, because that wasn't the case in 2009. It really was more focused on lower level energy auditing jobs or rooftop installing jobs. And now, I find such enjoyment. I worked with a group of DPS students the last couple of years who are really excited to try to figure out pathways to become electricians. And they're mostly really excited about, working with their hands, not necessarily going on and taking on more and more college debt, but ultimately realizing that it's a pretty short pathway to be able to have a pretty healthy, substantial salary that comes with it. But the one thing I do reflect on within that experience is the talk about just how unaffordable their community is starting to become, and how that they maybe aren't thinking that they're not going to be able to live in Denver, live in Aurora, and if they do get this training, they consider talking about moving to an area that has much less living expenses associated with it. So it might be just an issue around thinking about workforce. It might also be a housing issue as well. And I think that that's something smaller rural communities are really going to have to think of, because if you do sink in a lot of money for training, how are you going to keep people there to keep contributing to that clean energy economy if housing costs push out those individuals and they go to a place where they can afford to live comfortably in a larger home, but live far away from some of the opportunities we have in the clean energy economy?
Great. Thank you all. That clearly was a fantastic question. And I'm so happy that you guys gave such great responses. I wanted to give a quick plug because locally we have a grassroots organizing group called GVC3, Gunnison Valley Climate Crisis Coalition. So we're actively doing that here. Just a little plug for that. And then I wanted, Luke, as you were talking, DPS, for those that you don't know, it's Denver Public Schools. So there's an effort to start emphasizing more of the trades, more electricians and plumbers. So we have a couple questions here from the audience that I wanted to ask. The first one is, clearly, you're all interested in justice. How can we convince individuals and organizations that aren't interested to be better, and to do better? Basically, how can all of us support the vision that you're all working towards?
I'll give it a shot. As I'm getting older, I got my AARP card not too long ago, and so that's a sign. But I think the way to answer that question is just more collaboration, more discussion. I had a conversation earlier. I think a lot of our tribes think that we're isolated, we're separate. And that we should, do things on our own. And that's great. On the other side, it takes resources, it takes collaboration, it takes lessons learned. And so, I think collaborating, like, for example, the two tribes here, and I see it, they're working a lot with the city of Cortez and Durango. And so building those relationships. And so, in this whole transition, we're trying to move to another state. Clean energy, but the way I see it, Indian country is still at ground zero. They still have basics, energy audits and those things. We don't have homes to do energy audits on. And so going from, a certain type of fuel, we still have a lot of folks that burn wood for heat. And so, so we're not on the map yet. So how do we, if we call this a land of opportunity, how do we empower and how to provide the resources so that tribes can get to a position where they're proud that we're vibrant and we're a vital part of the communities that we all come from. And so that's how I see it. And so we still have a big road ahead of us. And so, but what I'm seeing, talking about grassroots, and I'm seeing a lot of younger folks becoming a part. I heard we had elections here yesterday. I think a lot of tribes have experienced elections. So a lot of younger folks are actually getting on tribal councils. And so in the past, tribal councils were deemed to be, you had to be elder, you had to be 50, whatever the age is. But I'm seeing a lot of younger natives actually deciding to run. They're either on the council or chairs. And so they're bringing, a new thought process to Indian country. And so I think it's more of, how do we work together? How do we empower ourselves? And so if you look at the whole history of Indian country and US, it was more, we're putting on a reservation, we're going to provide for you. But that plan is not working. So, I think just collaborating and using the best of the best, bringing folks home, lesson learned. I think that's really what we need for our tribal family members, our tribal community. So thank you.
Great. Thank you for sharing. Annie, would you like to go?
Yeah, I'm thinking about how I got interested in justice for housing and climate. And it really evolved when I came to Gunnison and I saw mobile home parks. And I was living on Spruce Street and my energy bill was $250 a month. And I was cold. And I was like, what is going on? I can't even imagine how cold this trailer park must be because those walls are not insulated whatsoever. They're lifted off the ground. And that's when I really learned about energy burden and how much of our neighbors are paying such a high percentage of their income towards their heating costs. And so I didn't know about mobile homes really, because when I lived in Boulder, a lot of them had been sold out and bought and removed. And so it had kind of gotten out of my vision. And so coming to Gunnison is when I really got involved in that and became an advocate in that area. And I think now when I bring that to my work, it's always trying to bring that to the table. Like, this is something that's impacted me. This is something that I want to keep talking about. And then I connect with others who are also talking about it and passionate about it. And then we hear more and more voices and realize, oh, we actually want to make this a priority and want to participate in some sort of funding or program to support that initiative. And so it's really bringing what, you have passionate interest about or going and finding something and bringing it to a conversation, whether it's about your health or economy or your background or somebody else in your workplace would want to explore that or bring that up front. I think stepping out and sharing that something's important to you, a lot of people realize, oh, that's also important to me. And that kind of builds that momentum there.
Yeah, so when I think about just transitions, which in my mind really equates to energy justice, it really starts with more of a recognition justice approach. And so I want to thank Derek for his lane acknowledgement, because I think that's really important to number one, acknowledge, the impacts to communities first, positive or negative. It really needs, to be thinking around how you kind of approach a more energy just system. And then, of course, thinking about distributive type of justice, where you're thinking, okay, well, everyone in the community is, are going to share in the burdens and the benefits of this transition. And not just have it to where we continue the pathways that we created, in the past of kind of developing our energy economy, and continue to develop sacrifice zones where just certain communities have to deal with all that new infrastructure, whether that's transmission lines, whether that's a big solar array, whether that's a big wind farm, or whether that's, a generation plant or a mining operation. I think, that there needs to be just some understanding that we could go in a different direction with clean energy that just repeats the sins of the past. And if it's not, if it's still, certain communities who have receive all of the benefits, and certain communities still dealing with all the burden, and we're not really moving towards a more just system around that. And then, of course, like the other big issue, and we've talked a lot about regulatory, and it's a real beast to be dealing with it, because it takes a lot of resources. It's super confusing, and I think it really hinders, individuals and citizens' ability to engage with the process. It's extremely frustrating, and it takes a lot of money to actually be represented in those conversations. So we need to somehow address the fact that there needs to be, a larger tent and a larger table set for those to have more equitable voices at the table when there is policy making and rule making happening in the regulatory environment. And that really doesn't exist right now. Accessibility within those conversations is extremely difficult, especially for, smaller grassroots organizations, maybe those who are focused in environmental justice. It's difficult to break through and make sure there really is more equitable voices, and an environment that kind of respects, everyone who will benefit and burden from these changes.
Hey, Luke, I have a follow-up question for you specifically. Talking about people who are advocating for themselves and their community in the light of environmental racism, it sounds like there might be a successful story that's happening in Elyria Swansea with the group in Commerce City. Is that right? With Lucy Molina?
Yeah, I guess, where were you thinking in terms of the success that's going on in that community? I've worked in that community a lot. I think,
It's happening.
So
maybe success is too strong of a word. But I
yeah,
wonder if you could talk a little bit about that story and the evolution of how that community is starting to gain traction and recognition, and people are finally starting to pay attention to what they've been asking for so long.
I think that is true in terms of that, because of, so I'll set the stage a little bit. When the expansion of I-70 happened, and they dug the tunnel or ditch, however you want to say, under, and took down the viaduct that was over the Elyria Swansea community. My organization helped kind of design the way we were going to mitigate those homes to decrease the impact of the highway construction, and then be able to add energy efficiency improvements, add a component that would ensure energy affordability for those homes, as potentially their energy might go up as we're sheltering in their homes more because their outside air environment was contaminated because of the construction. And also be able to match up those households with as many benefits associated with some of the renewable energy programs that we offer as well. And it added a tremendous amount of benefits to the homes in some ways. I think the resounding feedback we got from the community was really decreasing a lot of the noise pollution that was happening from the dog food plant processing that was close by, from the train activities, and from the highway. And I think, in the spotlight certainly kind of helped elevate the need to really show, demonstrate why it is called the most polluted zip code in America, because of this intersection of the highway pollution, the transportation and all the trucking centers that are there, and then of course the oil refinery and Suncor that's located right there. And so I think it's hard to say maybe it's a success right now, but at least there is a spotlight that something needs to be done. And currently right now there are talks around fixing I-270. That is the highway that goes through Commerce City, right above Suncor, and expanding that highway and maybe doing things differently where those households will maybe benefit more than Elaria Swansea households did, because the lessons learned from the initial project. And I think, moving forward, I think it's still going to be an issue for that community to just have to still deal with, that all of those pollution sources still exist. And certainly it's going to be some difficult discussions around what happens long-term with the oil refinery of Suncor. But, there needs to be, I think, more attention paid to kind of bringing more economic opportunities to that community, right? There was a real effort to really come in and try to listen to the community and then provide those services. But again, economic opportunities, they didn't follow, and they still aren't there in that community. And we have an opportunity to change that if there's ways to, if it's designed properly. One thing that we talk about a lot within that community, because I think transportation is a huge issue. For a long time, the community was cut off completely from Denver. You really couldn't make your way into the city center very easily. And still, it's very difficult to do that. It's still somewhat kind of cut off from the main center of the city. But really thinking about, how can we expand transportation issues there, options there and accessibility there, because there really is not very many options. And, maybe using the clean energy transition to further those efforts. And if we're, going to put, one idea that has been thrown around a lot, which is how could you incorporate some of the push for transportation electrification and car charging stations, locate those in those communities and subsidize the rates that are associated with those charging stations, and then provide incentives that are connected with transportation services like Lyft and Uber that bring drivers, bring an opportunity of employment for drivers, but also bring transportation options for the community, because, those communities because they're cut off, there's not a lot of economic opportunity up there. That's not where a lot of those transportation services operate. I think back many times when working in the community, how long it took me to get a taxi out of that neighborhood. And it was because of the drivers and having no incentive to ever go up there, because it didn't really meet the kind of economic needs they needed to be able to run their service that day. So I think that there's real opportunity, if we're intentional about it, to combine those resources and bring more to those communities.
Great, thank you all. So we have a few more minutes left. Another question from the audience. Should governments provide financial support to communities/workers that lose jobs through the shift to cleaner energy?
In my experience in my area, that actually is happening. I know that, we've seen 2 power plants, coal-fired power plants shut down, and those power plants provided, many jobs and revenue to our government. And so our tribe now is trying to launch a campaign with the Regulatory Commission to allow for payment for those workers that were displaced. And so, and the reason for that was that, because of 50 years of operations on the reservation, and then they just pick up and left, more of a, this is the humane thing to do. It's in line with, transforming to a new economy. And so in this case, I think, and I've seen other tribes, launch those kinds of attacks. We've been here to help support the growth of the Southwest, with the generation of electricity and the siting of high voltage transmission lines. And so now we're moving to a new form of economy, and now we're getting left behind. And so with the history of tribes being there to support the growth of many cities, I think a lot of tribes are saying, yes, it's the right thing to do. So I thought that was a good example of that. Raise everybody here. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Luke or Annie?
Yeah, I think there's an opportunity for state government, federal or local governments to offer incentives to kind of upskill and provide educational opportunities to shift in a career and shift the skills into a new area. And so I work in the field of incentives and rebates, and part of our requirements are to provide incentives to train qualified contractors to support income qualified households. So there's opportunities to kind of layer in education to then support that household who may be transitioning from their oil and gas focused job to a renewable energy focused job, to then also go one step further and help them focus their business or develop a business to then focus on supporting more of their neighbors and their income qualified neighbors. So I hope there's a few layers in there to offer a few incentives to motivate kind of a longer path forward.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that incentives need to be provided. And I think back on a project you and I worked on, Emily, which is for the city of Denver, and trying to map out a building electrification plan and talking to contractors. And I think we're still struggling with that right now around how to incentivize training for these smaller contractors, because it's the opportunity of providing the training for free isn't working very well. It's not necessarily respectful of the slim margins of a small business, and sending someone as a paid employee to a training for several days or an entire day where you're losing, profitability and revenue, where that worker could be out in the field. I think, there needs to be an understanding that a shift from your business model and the training that comes with that is an expensive proposition for small businesses with slim margins. And so there's got to be some way to kind of support that instead of really, I think, the stick way of doing it, which is regulatory ways of forcing it. And then maybe those costs are then borne by consumers more. I think, that's something that is a little concerning from, and I appreciate Annie must have a tough job with this, but how to roll out some of the building performance standards, and knowing that maybe those are going to have impact on our healthcare cost, certainly going to have impact on housing cost. So how do we balance that? And I think that's it's kind of the same thing with workforce. We have to respect that, there are going to be major costs for these transitions, and so, an incentive mechanism to ease that might be the way to accelerate it.
Thank you all. So we have 5 more minutes. I have one more question that I'd like to ask, but then I also want to allow you all a couple minutes to share anything that we might have not covered. So the last question from the audience, along the lines of justice, how do you approach the health of those in areas where materials for renewables are extracted? For example, lithium extraction. Yep, Luke, take it away. Thank you.
I mean, yeah, I think number one, we probably need to develop more consumer transparency around the products that we buy. If there really is an intentionality behind, the ethical work practices of developing countries and the products that are produced, that, there needs to be some responsibility on the consumer side of things, of number one, knowing that, but also understanding that that choice might be made if there is a higher cost associated with a more ethically sourced, material. And, I think this also kind of brings into question, which is a great conversation for consumers to have, is just, for them just to have a better understanding of how we source and refine all these materials. And if the materials are extracted and mined out of Africa, that it's shipped to China to be refined and smelted, because we don't do that in this country anymore because of environmental regulations. And then it's shipped to us as consumers in America to then put in electric vehicles or in our iPhones. What really, that there is a real choice there that I think needs to, ultimately be understood by the consumers. And then if there's a higher price associated with that, and I think this will translate to clean energy as well, then that's a consumer choice as well. Something like, what happened when we actually put Energy Star ratings on appliances, and you made that at least to where there's a choice and potentially a cost implication, but the consumer had that choice.
Annie or Derek, do you have anything to add?
I know that in the last, especially as we're talking about renewable energy development, solar powers and the minerals from that. I think there's a study from the Department of Energy, the EIA, saying that there's a lot of rare earth minerals on reservations. And so, but getting back to the third world, experience, do tribes really want to be a part of the supply chain and providing those rare earth minerals and other components? And so that's a big discussion right now. What does that mean for a tribe? So it gets back into, like, for example, the coal mining industry, strip mining, you have a coal-fired generation plant, so a lot of negative environmental consequences. And so a lot of tribes do recognize that they have the resources, the raw materials on the reservations, but the question is at what expense? And so the big question is, how do you balance trying to provide a revenue for the government, but also, trying to be environmentally sensitive, because a lot of tribes, we do follow a lot of traditional cultural practices, which involve our environment, our land, and our earth. And so how do we have a balance between that and actually putting food on our table, by selling our resources? And so I think that's a discussion, a debate that, will happen in the next future. How do tribes become a part of this, new energy scheme? Yes.
Thank you. Annie, was there anything you wanted to add? No?
No.
Okay,
It's good.
that's fine. So we have 1 minute left. Is there anything any of you would like to add before we conclude?
Well, for me, I just want to say, thank you for everybody's participation and the involvement of tribal government and our indigenous folks. I think is very, very important. I'm used to the word Native American, Indian, but the new term is indigenous. And so I've been very, very happy as I go around the country to see the recognition of tribes, in our daily talk. And so that's really important because we are here. I mentioned, Wall Street. I did go spend some time in New York, and my neighbors they found that we're native. They want to know if we still live in teepees, and so we still have that in, that kind of thought in this country, which is sad. And so when you go back to the textbooks, there's not enough there to say, the indigenous Native Americans, that's who they are. And so, but I'm glad that, there's more recognition of our tribal families and brothers and sisters. And so, because we're all, as I say now, we're all family. We're all related because we all have 5 fingers. We're all 5 fingers at the same. And so we're all one. So thank you for your time this afternoon.
Thank you so much for being here. Annie, is there anything you wanted to add?
Well, I've just really enjoyed meeting you all. Thank you so much. And I really want to put these just transition initiatives and ideas at the forefront of our program development. And I'd love to hear from anybody in the audience during lunch of what you're doing and where you're from and what's going on in your communities. So love to hear more from you, and the Colorado Energy Office would like to hear more from you all as well too. So thank you.
And I'll just quickly add, I would talk about this all day. So come find me if you want to talk about it more at lunch or later on this afternoon, and don't want to be the one who's holding us up for lunch. And that was a perfect way to end it, Derek. And thanks, Annie. And this was great.
Thank you all. Well, I'd like to invite you all to thank our panelists with me.
All right. Thank you, Emily, and our Just Transitions panel. We will now break for lunch. We will meet back here at 1:30 for our utilities panel. Lunch will be served in the UC ballroom, which if you exit this room is to the left down the hallway. And we are also offering our tour of the Rady School Geothermal Energy System at this point in time. So if you're interested in going on that tour, please meet our students, Abby Gridley and Sam Pickus. We'll meet you out in the hallway. If you exit the hallway and head left, they'll be out there waiting for you and we'll walk you over to the Rady School. We'll see you at 1:30.